Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. In today's episode, we will be covering flexibility and self-compassion and how psychological flexibility and self-compassion work together to create a more productive and fulfilling life. To guide us in this topic is Dr. Miriam Liss, Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychological Science at the University of Mary Washington and is a member of UMW's Interdisciplinary Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies program. She is a clinical psychologist and received her Ph.D. from the University of Connecticut in 2001. She has been recognized for her teaching and research, receiving the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award in 2015. At the University of Mary Washington, she won the Young Outstanding Faculty Award in 2005, the Wapel Professional Achievement Award in 2020, and the William Anderson Distinguished Professorship in 2024. She was also named one of Princeton Review's Best 300 Professors in 2012. She has published over 60 articles on an extensive range of topics, including sensory processing, self-injury, autism, feminist identity, the objectification and sexualization of women, division of labor, minority stress theory, motherhood, social media, mindfulness, self-compassion, and psychological flexibility. That is a very outstanding list. Many of her publications are in collaboration with undergraduate student co-authors. She is co-author of Psychology of Women and Gender, published by Norton, currently in its second edition, and Balancing the Big Stuff, Finding Happiness in Work, Family, and Life, published by Rowman and Littlefield. So, with that outstanding bio behind us, we are very lucky to be welcoming Dr. Miriam Liss joining us on the show today. So, hi Miriam, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we dive into our topic, we'd like to ask, what compelled you to pursue your studies in psychology?
Well, it was kind of inevitable. Both of my parents were related to psychology. My mom was a clinical social worker. My father was actually a researcher in psychology, but had some struggles, so I didn't really grow up with him. And I was also kind of raised by my mom's boyfriend, who was a clinical psychologist. I didn't originally necessarily want to go into psychology because it was surrounded me and I wanted to, differentiate myself.
Yeah.
I had lots of other interests in college. I was going to be a theater major, maybe a philosophy major. But once I took my first psychology class, I realized I really, really, love psychology and I was good at it.
Nice.
And I realized what I really wanted to do is teach and do research, and psychology was a great way to be able to do that. So I followed my parents' footsteps despite my better judgment.
Ended up doing it anyway. That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, let's try and get to know you a little bit better as well. Okay. So this is our first segment, Have You Met Miriam? So firstly, what do you enjoy doing in your spare time?
Well, I enjoy spending time with my family. I have 2 teenagers. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. We like to go on family adventures, family vacations, explore Virginia, which is where I live. It's beautiful. I love to read, watch movies, spend time with my friends.
Amazing.
Go to trivia nights, Also,
trivia nights are great. I get so competitive at trivia.
We get pretty competitive too.
Yeah. It's really funny because I'm really pretty bad, but I get really competitive.
I'm really bad also, but my husband is excellent, so I feel that I deliver him to the party, and it really helps a lot. So.
Well, you mentioned they're reading and watching movies as well. Have you got any books or movies that you've enjoyed recently?
Yeah. Well, I don't get to read for pleasure as much during the school
Mm,
year. So it has been a while since I've really dug into a good novel. But
yeah.
I was thinking about this question. And
Mm,
recently, the book that really stuck out to me that I read most recently is a book called Wellness by Nathan
mhm,
Hill. It's just an absolutely beautiful novel about a couple. They meet, they fall in love, they have a very romantic kind of meet cute, but then you see them as their lives progress and they get very disaffected. They're looking for their meaning in life. It's an exploration of psychology in a lot of ways, of the placebo
mm.
effect, of what brings us meaning, of how people can really like lose each other, but then come back together. And I just absolutely loved it and recommended it to everybody. So
Wow.
that's my recommendation.
That's great. That's a great recommendation for our
Yeah.
audience. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment? Are you a podcast listener at all?
I do. I listen to podcasts, as I drive to and from work.
Mm,
And there's a podcast that I just recently discovered because I do listen to a lot of political podcasts and the New York Times app, but I wanted something a little bit different to take my mind off of politics. And I discovered this advice podcast called Oversharing, where
mhm,
it's a clinical psychologist named Naomi Bernstein and her younger sister, and they read letters from listeners. They give advice. They do ethical dilemmas. They talk about
mm.
triggered situations, and they're just so genuine and honest. And they really do take a mindfulness approach. The psychologist, I really like her a lot. And she has a very kind of philosophy that's very similar to mine. So I
Yeah.
find her advice is really great. So I really enjoy it. It drops on Tuesdays and I always
Ah,
listen to it first thing. So
yeah, absolutely.
that's my favorite podcast right now.
That's great. Do you have a role model that you could share with us?
Yeah. I mean, in college, I really admired my professor and mentor. Her name was Jill Morowski, and she was just so
Mhm,
brilliant and really got me excited about psychology. Plus, she was a professor at a small liberal arts university, which is kind of what I
mm.
wanted to do. So she became my
Yeah.
kind of my academic role model. But I also want to call out to my mother as a role
Mm,
model. She was a clinical social worker. She passed away in 2017
mm.
after a long battle with Alzheimer's. But as a
Right,
mother,
yeah.
she raised me. She was a single mom. She was the most kind and compassionate person. People just were drawn to her. She had wonderful energy. And I just really, you always say you're going to grow up and turn into your parents. And
Yeah.
I definitely have. So,
There you go. Well,
which,
thank you for sharing that with
mm.
us. My last question, this might be kind of related to your professor that you were talking about. This question is, what is a class or a course that you've taken that has inspired you?
So I saw that question, and I haven't actually taken a course in a really, really long time, but
Yeah.
I've taught, but but I'm teaching classes. So
Yeah.
right now, I'm teaching a research seminar where I have 4 groups of students doing a variety of different research projects, and
Hmm.
they are very much inspiring me because they're really coming together. They're really collaborative. They're excited about the research. They're working well together. They're taking my feedback. They're inspiring me as students. They're doing really neat 4 neat research projects. Maybe I'll talk about them later.
Yeah.
And so that class is inspiring me. And when I teach psychology of women and gender, which is
Mm.
the class that I wrote the textbook for, so
Yeah.
I taught that about 2 years ago last time, and that was just an every time I teach that, it's utterly inspiring. The conversations
Yeah.
that we have, the students really think about things differently and think so critically. So
Mm.
I have to mention the classes I've taught because I haven't actually taken one
No, of course. No, that's so lovely
in a
that you
while.
get That's so lovely that you get inspired by your students, though. It's
Yeah,
nice to hear. As
yeah,
somebody who's like recently graduated, it's nice to hear, I
yeah.
guess. So, we're going to dive into some of our interview questions, but these first ones, let's just get the basics down. So, how would you define personal productivity?
So I would define personal productivity as being able to work towards your valued goals. So it's
Mm,
not just about getting as much done as possible and being the, you know, just most productive kind of, rat in the cage doing what you're
yeah.
told, but really figuring out what's important to you. And working towards valued goals is a really key part to psychological flexibility, which I'm going to talk about later.
Yeah.
So when you think about it in that way, it's really figuring out what's meaningful to you and
Hmm.
working towards that, not just doing what other people are telling you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, secondly, how would you define self compassion?
So, self compassion has to do with approaching yourself with kindness and understanding in the same way you might approach a friend. So, imagine a scenario where you mess up at work and you tell a friend, "Oh, I really messed up at work." And imagine if your friend said to you, "Well, of course you did. You're worthless and you're a loser and you're never going to do well." You would say, I mean, that would be
Mm,
a ridiculous thing to hear, right? And
yeah.
any friend who said that would not be a person that you would want to stay friends with. And you can't even
No.
imagine that happening. But those are the types of things we say to ourselves all the time, right?
Hmm.
Like if you messed up at work, you'll say those words to yourself, words that you would never say to a friend,
No,
right? And
of
if you
course not.
heard from a friend, you would say, "I'll never be your friend," right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we have to treat ourselves the way we would treat anyone else. We
Mm,
tend to be better, especially for people we love, of being compassionate and caring towards others, but it's a lot harder to give that compassion to ourselves. So the first
mm,
piece of self-compassion is just a sense of kindness to ourselves. So it also involves just being open to the fact that we're not perfect, and that's okay. We can be kind to ourselves about that. And then there's a sense of common humanity. So we're all human and we all make mistakes.
mm.
And that's okay. So self-compassion kind of also involves a connection to other people because everybody makes mistakes. And if you make a mistake, you can be just as kind to yourself. And then
Mm.
there's a component of mindfulness. So it's just
Right.
being open, being aware. Okay, I did this thing and I don't have to run away from it. I don't have to avoid it. I can be okay with that. It's a little different than self-esteem. So
Mm.
self-compassion and self-esteem are not the same thing. Self-esteem is just saying, "I'm great. I'm positive. Everything about me
Yeah.
is good," right? It's just focusing on all your positive qualities. But
Yeah.
self-compassion is a lot more nuanced and a lot more powerful because it's about accepting all of the components of yourself, um,
Mm.
and including your negative attributes and being kind to yourself about them.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm glad you compared it to self esteem as well, because I feel like the two might get mixed up, sometimes.
Yeah,
So,
for
yeah,
sure.
thank you for expanding. So, my next question then is, how would you define psychological flexibility?
Okay, so this is a complicated idea, and
Okay.
psychological flexibility is a theory of psychological health that is at the basis of a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy.
Hmm.
And it's linked to like a larger philosophy of the way our language and cognition works. So basically, the idea is that as humans, we have this remarkable capacity for thinking and for language. And that's fantastic. It's allowed us to, create the society that we have. But it also is a double edged sword because we
Mm.
spend a lot of time living in our thoughts and responding to things that we think about or worries about the past or imaginings
Mm.
about what other people are thinking or worries about the future and not actually responding to the realities of the present moment. And so that could actually make us unable to do the things that we value because we kind of
Mm.
get stuck in worrying about the past or thinking that this might be too hard or this might be too anxiety provoking. So,
Yeah.
psychological flexibility allows us to tolerate distress and accept some of these negative emotions. It's very related to self compassion because,
Mm.
we can be compassionate to ourselves about those negative emotions. Um,
Yeah.
so, it actually has six components.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
I could talk about. There's actually 6 components of psychological flexibility, so I'll just briefly define them, then we can
Sure.
talk a little bit more about them.
Yeah,
So
of course.
the first one is acceptance, which is
Hmm.
basically the willingness to experience negative internal events. So you can have distressing thoughts,
Mm.
and you don't have to say, "That's a bad thought." I mean, that's we often do when we have thoughts,
Yeah.
say, "That's a bad thought, I can't have that thought." But it's
Mm.
acceptance is accept things as negative thoughts.
Sure.
The next component is something called cognitive diffusion, which is a pretty
Okay.
interesting idea. So cognitive diffusion is the idea that our thoughts are just our thoughts. We don't have to be. So when we're fused to our thoughts, we take them as though they're 100% reality. And if we think that somebody is having a negative thought about us, or that we're going to do something wrong, or that we have done something wrong, we just believe that. So that's when we're fused. So diffusion is realizing that our thoughts are just our thoughts and we don't actually have to believe them. The third is contact with the present moment. So that has to do with mindfulness and also related to self-compassion, because it's a non-judgmental awareness of what we're thinking and the process of thinking, which, our thoughts are just our thoughts, so we can just pay attention to them and we don't have to evaluate them or judge them. So that's related to mindfulness, which is people are usually pretty familiar with.
Yeah.
The next component is pretty abstract. When I taught this to my students, I spent a whole year researching this with my students, and we just would spend, an entire class period like, what? What is this? And the idea is self as context. So what this means is that there's a stable sense of self. There is a us that's different from our thoughts. So, for example, there's a mind that does the thinking and worrying, but then there's also, if you meditate, you'll notice there's an observer of the mind. So if you ever do a meditation practice, you'll sometimes be able to, you're supposed to notice your thoughts, and then you'll realize there's a you that's noticing the thoughts. There's a few like metaphors about this. Like, so for example, our thoughts and feelings and worries are like the clouds. But we aren't the clouds, we're the sky. The sky is always there and the clouds move and change. Or another analogy that my students loved is that the thoughts and feelings are like the chess pieces. And some might be, and you can have a war with them. And this is a good thought and this is a bad thought. And they can try to fight with each other and say, I shouldn't have this thought, or this thought is bad. But that's not you. You're the chess board.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
My students would sit there, we'd be like, I am the chessboard. We're kind of like, we are the board. We have to really get our head around that. So there's two more. The next two are values. So that I mentioned earlier when I said that personal productivity had to do with working in alignment with your values. So values are the qualities that are important that you decide are important that you want to strive for. So a lot of people aren't really in touch with their values or don't really know what's important, but it's a really important part of psychological flexibility is to articulate what is important to you. And then finally, committed action, which is taking actual steps and working towards your values. So those are the 6 components of psychological, and they all kind of work together. And they are kind of related to self-compassion, because the real way to be able to have psychological flexibility and have these distressing thoughts, but not believe them or be overwhelmed by them, is to have a sense of self-compassion towards them. So they are intertwined.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really liked the metaphors as well. Metaphors just make things easier to understand sometimes.
They really do.
It helps when it's a tricky concept that it's a bit abstract. It doesn't seem real to like put some pictures on it and then you go, oh, I get it now.
Acceptance and commitment therapy is chock full of metaphors. I have a few more we can talk about later.
Absolutely. So now that we've defined those 3 things, can you tell me how would you describe the relationship between psychological flexibility, compassion, and personal productivity?
Okay. So they're very intertwined. If personal productivity is defined by working in accordance to your values, right? Then psychological flexibility helps get us there. It also can allow us in workplace settings to actually respond to what's actually going on. I think a lot of times at work, people get mired down in their own internal thoughts and their own worries. Am I doing this right? Am I doing this well? Am I messing up? And they can get kind of stuck and not be as productive even in the workplace, right? So if we can respond to what's really happening in the world through contact with the present moment, through being able to be aware of negative emotions, but not sucked in by them so that we fully believe that they're all true, but letting them kind of pass like a cloud. We can be more aware of what our values are and then be more productive towards those values. So for
Right.
example, let's say it was an important value to you to be a really good mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is to go to your child's soccer game,
Yeah.
but you have social anxiety. So going to a soccer game makes you anxious, right?
Okay.
So, you could say that personal productivity would be being able to go to the soccer game. That's not workplace productivity, but it's still working in alignment with your values, right?
Mm.
So being flexible would be, instead of saying the only way I can go to the soccer game is if I eliminate all my anxiety, right? Then I can go. Well, then you may never go because you may
Yeah.
never eliminate your anxiety, right?
Yeah.
So from a acceptance and commitment therapy perspective, or if you're valuing psychological flexibility, you would flip that a little and say, you know what? I'm going to experience anxiety, and those are going to be my thoughts, and I'm going to have
Mm.
emotions, and I'm going to have bodily sensations, and I'm still going to go to the game because that is my value, and the goal, the action. My value is to be a good mother, and the committed action is to go to the soccer game and support my kid. And as
Mm.
these distressing thoughts, like worries about what other people are thinking of me or being overwhelmed by the stimulation, come up, I'm just going to let them be thoughts. But I'm
Mm.
going to still be able to do the thing. And it's not necessarily going to be easy. It's not going to
No.
be like, yay, I'm not experiencing anxiety. But it's still going to
Mm.
be that you are able to do your goal. And in this case, that's how I'm defining productivity, because that's committing an action that's aligned with your values. Right.
Yeah.
But that could be the same thing for more of a workplace productivity. If you have a public speech you have to give, right? Or a
Mm.
presentation you have to do at work, or a podcast interview that you're nervous about, right?
Yeah.
Right? You could, say, well, I can't do it unless I've limited all my anxiety, or, you could get stuck and not be able to do it. But if
Mm.
you have a more, compassionate approach and say, yeah, I'm going to be nervous. Yeah, maybe I'm going to mess up. It's not going to be perfect. Um, but I'm going to do it anyhow,
Mm.
because you're able to tolerate those negative emotions,
Yeah.
which is part of seeing thoughts and emotions as just thoughts and emotions, but not taking them so seriously, not necessarily believing them. So they're all kind of tied in together, right? Um,
Mm.
they're all kind of intertwined.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this also ties into a mantra that I've kind of been seeing a lot on social media recently, which is the do it scared. And it's
Oh
like
yeah, it's exactly
yeah,
that. I
that's
haven't seen that.
exactly what you just described. Oh, I've seen it
Yeah.
everywhere where people are
Oh,
like, you know,
yeah. You
tricky
don't.
things come up in life that you've got to do. And if you don't do them, you won't, achieve your goals or feel fulfilled in yourself. So
Yeah.
do it scared. Like you
Yeah.
can,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Oh,
Yeah.
there's also research. Wait. Oops.
Go on.
Okay. Um,
You're all good.
okay. So there's also research that links specifically self-compassion
Mm.
to growth mindset, and also trying harder to improve, which is,
Mm.
you would think, might be um, counterintuitive. You might say, oh, well, self-compassion means that you just accept all your flaws so you don't need to change. But that's actually not the case. There's actually a couple of really interesting studies that have just come out that have linked higher levels of self-compassion to the desire to improve and to get better. And the reason is
Mm.
because the only way you're going to improve is if you acknowledge what your flaws are
Yeah.
and where you can actually get better. If you think you're great all the time, right? Then
Mm.
you're not going to seek to improve. But
Yeah.
if you are like mired down in your flaws and just think, "Oh, I messed up. I'm a terrible loser. I'll never get better." You're also not going to be able to improve. But
Mm.
if you can take this more compassionate approach, right? Where you acknowledge your faults, realize
Yeah.
you're not perfect, but also realize nobody is perfect. You experience a sense of common humanity. It's okay.
Mm.
That actually, it's this paradox where, acceptance actually leads to a desire and willingness to change. It's been linked to growth mindset. There have been studies where they've actually give encouraged people to either um, exhibit self-compassion towards themselves after they mess up on a test or remember a negative experience, to have no intervention on themselves, or to do a self-esteem intervention where they just think about all the reasons why they're great.
Yeah.
And the people who do self-compassion are more likely to try harder the next time.
Right. Yeah.
Which is pretty cool, right? Because it doesn't lead to complacency. You're not just accepting your
No.
flaws and thinking, I'm perfect. You're accepting your flaws and saying, being open to your flaws,
Yeah.
right? And being like, oh, yeah. And then you'll be more likely to change. So I think that research is really cool because I think sometimes people might be like, well, I can't be compassionate towards myself because then I'll never get better. Then I'll just accept, right, all my negative parts and I won't try to improve.
Right.
But it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So speaking of compassion, that's actually what I wanted to ask you next. How does showing self-compassion impact our mental health?
Oh, so much great research. I mean, it's interesting because I just was looking at a study that said that self-compassion was related to well-being stronger than compassion for others.
Wow.
I mean, compassion for others is important, but sometimes it was interesting. It actually said that women tend to have more compassion for others than men. So it's like gendered because they take on more of a caregiving role.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be too much where they don't pay attention to themselves at all. But actually self-compassion had a stronger link to well-being, happiness, all of those things are, so many research studies that have linked self-compassion to well-being. One study that I did years ago looked at self-compassion and body image and found that people, I mean, it seems like it would make a lot of sense, right?
It does make sense, yeah.
But that there's a theory in psychology of women and gender called objectification theory that says that we tend to, women especially, but also men, but many people take an external view of the body, this kind of self-objectified view where they start to view their body from an observer's perspective and just kind of worry how they're looking. It's called body surveillance. And that usually leads to body shame and depression and anxiety and all these negative, horrible things. So a study I did like many years ago found that self-compassion doesn't keep you from having body surveillance, but it interrupts the path between body surveillance and feeling that shame. So you can say, oh, yeah, here I am. I'm looking at how I'm looking. All right. It is what it is. Exactly, it may not be what I want it to be, right? So that was one of the studies that I did on self-compassion. But there's a lot of research linking it to all sorts of mental health.
Yeah, interesting. And so in a similar vein, how can the concept of productivity or personal productivity positively or negatively impact our mental health?
I think especially if you define productivity the way I defined it, which is working towards your values. I mean, I think if you're leading a life where you know what you're doing and you know why you're doing it, you're not always going to necessarily be like having the most fun all the time, right? So there's a difference between hedonic happiness, which is like, yay, party, it's so much fun, and eudaimonic happiness, which is the sense of your life is meaningful and you are living towards a purpose. So if you are living in accordance to your values, sometimes you're going to be doing things that are difficult and not fun, but you're going to be meaningful. And so you're going to have a real higher sense of that your life is meaningful and that you're a sense that what you're doing is important. So, which is also related to feeling good on a day-to-day level. I mean, they're related to each other. But, So I think if you are productive in that way, so not necessarily just doing well because the boss tells you, do this assignment and you got it done fast, but personal productivity defined as living in accordance to your own values.
Yeah. I suppose it's more fulfilling to live in accordance to your values and find meaning rather than just like going out and having fun and partying if that's not actually what you want in the long term. So
exactly. And that could be fun. I mean, that's also fun. And if you're doing it and you're in the moment and you're enjoying it and you're savoring the experience, like have at it, that might be what your values are right there. It's connection, it's fun, it's, living in the moment, but they're not always the same because sometimes the things that we do that are valuable are also difficult.
Yes. That makes total sense.
A sense of meaning in life would be really much more linked up than just feeling happy all the time.
So earlier you mentioned there were 6 core aspects to psychological flexibility. What could people do to enhance them?
Great question. So acceptance and commitment therapy uses a lot of metaphors. So let me just start by kind of one of their famous metaphors that will kind of help think about all of them together, and then we can talk
Hmm.
about a few of them more specifically. Um,
Great.
One of the best acceptance and commitment therapy metaphors is called the
Yeah.
passengers on the bus. So if you think about your life is you driving a bus, and the path that you want to take is the road in front of you. Okay. And
Hmm.
hopefully that road is moving towards your values, is driving down committed action in line with your values, right?
Hmm.
But as you drive through your life, you're taking these passengers on a bus, and these are childhood experiences, memories, things that may have happened to you that trigger you in a variety of ways. Okay. And
Mm.
some of these passengers are great. They sit on the bus and they're quiet, or they encourage you, or push you in the right direction, or just sit quietly. But some of
Hmm.
them are really loud and noisy and critical, and they yell at you and they tell you, you're going the wrong way, or you're never going to be able to
Mm.
go down this road because you don't have it in you, or you don't have what it takes, or you're not strong
Hmm.
enough, right? One of those passengers might be your self-critic who's not at all self-compassionate, right? That's how it all
Yeah.
links together. Um, so there's a lot of things you could do, right? You could try to ignore them entirely, right?
Hmm.
And just kind of shut them out, or right. But they keep coming up and they keep yelling at you and telling you go this way or that way, or get off the bus, right? So that might work for a while. That would be like kind of suppression, right? Where we just kind of try
Mm.
to take those negative thoughts and push them away and like not acknowledge them at all. But
Yeah.
that only works for so long, right?
Mm.
Another technique would be to argue back, right? So you say, "No, passenger, you're wrong. You all of your criticisms of my driving are incorrect." And you're like, "Sit back down," and you turn around. But if you do that, you're not looking at the road anymore, right?
Mm.
You're like, you had to pull over. You had to, you're not driving down the road because you're like you're spending all your time like yelling and arguing with your passengers. So that would
Mm.
be right. Um, or you could just kind of white knuckle it through and just say, "I'm going to get through. I'm going to ignore them," right? Um,
Hmm.
but that also only lasts for so long. So instead, because these passengers are your thoughts and your feelings and your negative emotions and all your self-judgment and your non-compassionate self, is to just let them be there. Let them talk, right? Do it scared, right? They might say,
Mm.
"This is scary. The road is scary. Don't go. Don't go. There's trees on the road," or right?
Yeah.
And so the passengers are going to be there, but they're not driving the bus. They're not going to grab the wheel.
Mm.
You're the only one who's going to grab the wheel, right?
Mm.
So you can continue down your path, even though the passengers are there. Maybe they're yelling at you. Maybe they're screaming, but they're not driving the bus. You're driving the bus, right? So
Wow.
that's a nice metaphor to just kind of think about how you can still steer your life, even if there's all these negative emotions or these things that come up or these triggers from your childhood. Um, it doesn't have to control you. So I just like that metaphor. It's another
That's a great
kind of
metaphor. Yeah, it makes so much
cla-
sense.
classic acceptance and commitment metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's some more specific techniques. So for
Okay.
acceptance, acceptance has a lot to do with accepting your negative emotions. So if that passenger is anxiety, right? Instead of being like, "Get
Mm.
back there, anxiety, sit down, you're not allowed on this bus," right?
Yeah.
You would just accept it, and you can actually try to think about it, like almost physicalize it. Like, okay, if you were talking to someone, like, what does that anxiety look like? What does the passenger, if the anxiety was a passenger on your bus,
Mm.
what would it look like? Can you draw it? What does your critic look like? Can you draw a picture of it? So it kind of creates like they're there. They might be talking to you and you can accept them, but you don't have to let them control you. So that
Mm.
might be, acceptance is really, really related to self-compassion, right? Is that I have these
Mm.
emotions and I'm not going to judge myself for them. I'm still going to be accepting of them.
Yeah.
So cognitive diffusion has a lot of very specific techniques. I mean, if you Google cognitive diffusion techniques, you'll get like a whole list of them. Um, I'll tell you a few of them.
Sure.
One of them has to do with changing the way you talk about your thoughts. So instead of saying, I'm so worried, because I'm so worried implies it's you that's worried. But if you change it to say, like, my mind is worrying or my thoughts are worrying right now, you're kind of creating just a little bit of separation between you and your thoughts,
Yeah.
right? Another technique is one I haven't really tried as much, but it kind of makes sense, is where you repeat a word over and over again. Like people will say milk 100 times. If you say like milk, 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 milk 100 times, you'll realize like it's just a word, like it doesn't have any meaning, right?
Yeah.
And that's the same thing, right? It's the same thing with your thoughts. If you're having thoughts like I'm stupid, I'm a loser, right? It's just words that you're telling yourself, right? It's just our language telling a story. You're just telling yourself a story, and it's not necessarily true. And so sometimes that can work and make people realize that these stories we tell are just stories. They aren't. You don't have to believe them, right?
Yeah.
Contact with the present moment is really, you can try a meditation practice, right? You know, there's been a lot about, you know, trying mindfulness meditation. That when you do a mindfulness practice, you're really trying to, you know, just follow your breath or be in the moment. And then the whole idea is that if you have a thought, you watch the thought, right? And you're like, oh, it's a thought, and then you can bring yourself back to the present moment, right?
Yeah.
So it's about, you know, mindfulness in general is supposed to be about, you know, observing and accepting awareness in a non-judgmental way. So the more we're in contact with the present moment, the more we're going to be able to deal with the road that we're on, as opposed to like the imagined roads or the fears that we have, right? Or be able to really figure out like what is actually happening. Like I feel like I spend a lot of time like creating these scenarios of things that could happen. Right? And then running through them, you know, and then like, you know, what if this happens? Oh my God. And then like you kind of start catastrophizing and then you get into the spiral. I mean, you know, even though I study this and I practice this, you know, I still do, you know, get into these like mind spirals, but at least I can be like, okay, yes, you are having a mind spiral. You are, this is not the present moment. None of this is actually happening. This is all just a story you're telling. Right.
Yeah.
So the more we can just practice being in the present moment, and then you don't have to have like an official mindfulness practice. You can also try it just in the moment, like just getting into your body. So sometimes when I'm driving, I'll be like, okay, I feel my hands on the steering wheel. Or if I'm sitting, I'll be like, okay, I can just like, where is my body right now? It's in the chair. Or you could just, you know, take a deep breath or two in the middle of the day. Because I think sometimes people think, well, I don't have time to meditate. Who has time for that? But you don't have to spend that much time if you kind of try to bring yourself into the moment as much as possible. Self as context is tricky. I mean, really the only way to get it is this idea of these metaphors and just to realize like I'm having these thoughts, but I am not these thoughts. There's like a deeper me, right? I'm the chess. You're supposed to say I'm the chessboard, right?
Yeah.
I'm the sky. And then for values, so there's a few suggestions. So for example, if you imagined yourself at 80 and looking back at your life, like what are the things you would want, you know, to have accomplished, to have people remember you for, right?
Yeah.
That's a way to think about like what's important. I mean, you can also like find like values checklists, and you can say, oh yes, family and, you know, spirituality. And there's a lot of, you know, are important. Another technique that they use in acceptance and commitment therapy is to imagine that there's a magic wand that got rid of all of your anxiety and shame. Okay. And all of your negative thoughts. And if you had that magic wand and waved it over yourself, what would you be working towards? What would you be doing? And then,
That's
of course,
really
obviously, there is no magic wand, right? So the anxiety and shame are just the passengers on the bus. And so we could still be working towards those things.
Yeah.
You know, even with all of our anxiety and shame, we just have to say, oh, hi, anxiety and shame. You're just I see you, right? You're on the bus next to me, yelling at me. I hear you. Thank you, shame. Right.
Yeah.
And then action is once we figure out our values, like what are we going to do? What are the steps we're going to take? How are we going to go, right? Do it scared, right?
Yeah.
But what exactly are the things that we're going to do, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I would focus on committed action.
Wow. That is so interesting. Those 6 aspects. There's obviously a lot of research that has been done on all of this, and that's fantastic advice and fantastic metaphors for people to remember as well. Um, all right. Well, let's move on now to exercising some of this psychological flexibility. So, in what ways does psychological flexibility or inflexibility differ from person to person?
So it definitely differs. There's all
Hmm.
sorts of scales to measure it, and ways that you can take a scale and say, some of them measure it on all 6 dimensions. Some of it
Mm,
are more focused on identifying what your valued goals are, and then answering questions or thinking about how difficult it is for you to work towards them, or how much you let these thoughts get in your way. So
mm,
and people who, study psychological flexibility really see this as kind of the underpinning of many psychological issues like depression and anxiety. Because if you think about people who are depressed, they're pretty inflexible, right?
yeah.
They're often stuck ruminating. Right, ruminating on their thoughts, rumination, which is like, thinking the same thought over and over again. That's
Mm,
usually quite distressing and worrying, about, what they're gonna do about it, or rehashing a negative experience in a non-productive way is one of the key aspects of depression, and that's all about believing your thoughts, allowing yourself to let the thoughts yell at you and kinda steer you
mm,
off the road
yeah.
of the bus you're driving, um, and anxiety too. I mean, psychological flexibility is not about getting rid of all of those negative emotions, but allowing them to be and still living your best life. But some people
Mm,
aren't able to do that, right? Some people really let a lot of people have these negative
mm,
thoughts and these negative feelings, and it paralyzes them, or they aren't really able to live the life they want to live, right?
yeah.
And so you can think of it as like a transdiagnostic set of psychological symptoms. By transdiagnostic,
Mm,
I mean it really covers a lot of psychological problems. But
mm,
also on the flip side, when you're flexible, some people really are able to enjoy their lives and experience greater meaning in life, and have a sense of authenticity because they're living their life in accordance with their values.
yeah.
And then they're all going to have this, and have greater sense of well-being and mental health. So it really does vary, but it's really linked in with all sorts of other psychological problems,
Yeah.
and the issues that we all struggle with.
Fascinating. Well, I'd like to move on now to what we can actually do to apply all of this theory that we've been talking about. So, when it comes to psychological flexibility, what habits or exercises or activities would you recommend people practicing? What can people do in their life to apply this?
So it's some of the things we've already talked about, but
Yeah.
it's remembering, the things I like to keep in mind when I'm practicing this myself or teaching it is
Mm,
that, you know, our thoughts are just our thoughts. We don't have to believe them, right?
hmm.
We can articulate or figure out what is important to us, and figure out how we're going to do the things that are important to us. And when things are tough and things are difficult and our thoughts get in the way, we can just allow the thoughts to be. I think a lot of
Mm,
people think, well, I'll do that when I can get rid of my anxiety, or I'll do
yeah.
that when I feel ready, like when I feel like I can do it, right? When I feel
Mm,
like I can do it without being scared. I actually think this like do it scared is a great little I love it. I'm
yeah.
gonna start saying that.
Yeah, it's good.
It's really good. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, practicing, developing a mindfulness practice where you try to spend a little bit of time every day really trying to notice your thoughts in a
Mm,
non-judgmental way. If you can, I mean, I personally struggle with this because I know
mm,
a daily meditation practice is the best thing, but I have been very uneven in my meditation
mm,
practice because I'm very busy and I have, a lot to do, and I never seem to have enough time.
yeah.
But recently I've really tried to take it much more seriously and really commit to it. And it really
Mm,
has been remarkably effective because I've noticed that I can, you know, sometimes my thoughts run away, but
Mm.
then that's okay. I take a self-compassionate approach, right? And
Yeah.
I'll bring them back. Um, in terms of self-compassion, I think that it's really important to pay attention to the words you use to yourself. And when you start
Mm.
to berate yourself, which people do,
Yeah.
stop and think, would I talk to my best friend that way? Right? And if you wouldn't, then you should probably try to talk to yourself in a different way. I
Yeah.
really have worked on this because, I am a perfectionist and very
Mm.
hard on myself. And so I have that's the thing. I started researching self-compassion before I started researching psychological flexibility, and I really applied it immediately to my life and really started to try to ease up on myself. And
Mm.
it helped a lot, got me through a lot of hard times. It's one thing, it's interesting because it's one thing to research things and to know about them in theory, and
Yeah.
another thing to apply them. So
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a work in progress too because I've been working
Mm.
on all of these myself, and it's like sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't, and sometimes my thoughts run away with me, and I catastrophize and I worry, but then I can bring myself back and say, okay, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not a bad person that my thoughts just got away. Be
Yeah.
self-compassionate, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, that's not what's happening right now. I can
Yeah.
try, anchor in the present moment and
Mm.
and then be kind to myself about it because it's never going to be perfect. So I think,
Yeah.
I just think we all need to be a little gentler with ourselves, and we need to
Yeah.
be more able to tolerate negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Which is hard. A lot of people do whatever they can to avoid negative emotions and negative experiences. So they'll avoid places that are stressful or situations that are stressful or, activities that trigger negative emotions. But the
Mm.
more we can tolerate them, the more we'll be able to do the things that are important to us and live our lives in according to our values. So I think,
Yeah.
every minute is a chance to practice this because we're always running a tape in our heads,
Mm.
right? And usually that tape is pretty mean
Yeah.
or stressed or critical or right. And so the more we can just be aware, oh, that's the tape in my head.
Mm.
That's cognitive diffusion, right? Oh, it's just a tape. It's just the words I'm telling myself. You don't have to believe
Yeah.
them. So it's just a constant practice of kind of reminding yourself, you know?
Mm. And when it comes to like meditation, for example, you mentioned that it's hard to find the time. What are some other challenges that people face when they try and do this practice?
I think it's very hard not to believe your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And you can, right? We think a
Yeah.
thing, especially a self-critical thing, and it feels so real, right?
Mm.
We imagine a scary future. We catastrophize something that's going to happen. We think somebody's mad at us because they didn't respond to our text or
Mm.
we do all this mind reading, and then, um, and it's really hard just because, okay, this person's mad at me or okay, this bad thing is going to happen. Um, it's really hard to not believe that.
Yeah.
And, I think it's our human nature. And I try to be compassionate about that because, I
Mm.
mean, if we didn't have, it's because we have language as humans. We have this amazing ability
Mm.
to, create stories and construct realities that aren't true, project ourselves into the future, remember ourselves in the past. That's an amazing skill. And it's
Mm.
why we have movies and books and the whole society we live in. So it's not like a bad thing that we
Yeah.
have this, but it has these negative effects. So it can be like it's okay that we're not getting it right and we're often mired in it. But the more we can just kind of separate and
Mm.
be able to see our thoughts, something I sometimes think about is just separate. There's my thoughts, but it's okay, but
Mm.
there they are. I'm not them. I can watch them. So I
Yeah.
think the challenge is that it it's so hard to not, it's just incredibly
Yeah.
hard. But
It
we
is.
to have these thoughts and not think that they're true
Mm.
or real or not let them stop us. I think it's
Yeah.
the fundamental challenge of being human.
Yeah, it's
So
kind of mind-boggling when people hear this for the first time, like, "Oh, you're not your thoughts." They go, but that's all I think about. Like,
Right.
what
How am
what
I?
else
How
is there?
am
Yeah.
I? Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really challenging. So I think it's like very human to
Mm.
not be able to do this, and
Yeah.
like it's a lifelong task to
And
try to
it's I guess it
do
comes
this
with
separation.
practice.
And it comes
Yeah.
with practice and with a sense of self-compassion, right? Like
Yeah.
you're not going to be like, "Oh, now I understand psychological flexibility. I'm going to be a flexible person from now on." Because that's not how
Yeah.
it happens. I've known about these concepts for, over 20 years and I still struggle with it.
Mm. So going back to how sometimes it's hard to find the time, and you mentioned like feeling where your body sits in space, like when you're driving on that kind of thing. Is there particular like times or places where you would recommend to people this is an option for you if you have a very busy life but you want to practice meditation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So lately,
Yeah.
I have a few techniques, but
Sure.
I'm really very much a work in progress.
Oh,
Um,
of course. Yeah.
um, lately, I have found I have managed to carve out 10 to 15 minutes after because I exercise. That's a very important part of my
Mm.
committed goals and for my towards my values is
Yes. Yeah.
I try to get to the gym every day most days. So that's like and I don't have time to meditate before that. But I do
Right.
have time after I like showered and I've like
Mm.
had my post-workout like snack and it's not
Yeah.
quite time to leave the office. I'm blessed to have a somewhat flexible job, so I have like a little bit of buffer time in there. So I can put
Mm.
10 minutes in there. But then also realized and a good friend of mine who's like very much more advanced in mindfulness practice than I am suggested that she said because I happen to also be blessed that I have an office that closes. She's like, "Why can't you meditate at work?" And I was like, "What?" She's like, "Can
Mm.
you can't close your door for 10 minutes?" And I was like, I can, but it never occurred to me to try to do
Yeah.
that. And not obviously not everybody has an ability to work and have their close their
Mm.
door. So I'm lucky to be. So I've tried that a few times and I found the morning is good. Sometimes I'll just listen to some kind of meditation before I go to sleep, and that's easier, right?
Mm.
Um, I love like sleep headphones that are flat so you can like
Oh.
meditate and then like
Oh, that's
fall.
nice.
Yeah, I'm like upset. Yeah, that's been like
Yeah.
something I've used for a very long time. So I can listen to meditations or relaxation tracks or, meditative
Mm.
music, or, just right before I go to bed or first thing when I get up. So I think it's like not technically the correct practice of meditation to do it half asleep in your bed.
Mm.
But as I asked my friend, she said, meditating lying down in your bed is better than not meditating.
Yeah.
But if you can sit up, like it's better because you're
Yeah.
a little bit more focused. And I have found that it's a better practice when I'm sitting up, but it's also nice to be able to know it's totally fine to just like lay down in your bed. And if sometimes it can help you
Mm.
sleep to do some kind of guided meditation. And there's a gazillion apps and websites and places
Yeah,
you can get
absolutely.
guided meditations and stuff. Yeah.
For sure. Well, I think that is some amazing advice for applying everything that we've been talking about to the real world and to your real life rather than just theory. So I'm going to move on now to our open mic segment. So if you haven't already covered it, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that you're particularly passionate about? Doesn't have to be related to what we've been talking about so far. So
Okay.
the floor is yours.
Okay. So the other thing, okay. I have actually several projects that I'm working on that I'm excited about. But
Yeah, go for it.
I will tell you about the one that I'm actually going to a conference. I'm going to the Association for Women in Psychology conference on Thursday in Santa
Wow.
Fe. Yes, it's
Mm-hmm.
gonna snow. It's gonna snow in Santa Fe, which is
Oh my goodness.
why is it gonna snow? The time I'm there, but that's all right.
Yeah.
And I'm presenting on this concept of mental load because, as you saw from my list of things, I,
Yeah.
I study a lot of things. It's not just mindfulness, self compassion, and psychological flexibility. I also do a lot of gender theory,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I'm very obsessed with the division of labor but more recently with
Mm.
the idea of mental load, which is the cognitive load that people take on of not just like doing the dishes, but like planning on what needs to get done. It's more of like a cognitive task and it has to do
Mm.
with, and also has to do with like delegating
Yeah.
responsibility. So it's one thing to say, oh, I help with the laundry, but it's nothing to like know when does the laundry have to get done and like who's in charge of it or what's the schedule or I mean, I
Mm.
have 2 teenagers, so it has a lot to do with like what are the activities, what are the schedules, when do they have to have doctor's appointments, who needs the
Yeah.
car, like keeping all of
Yep.
that in your head.
Yep.
Um, so
I'm relating to this a lot.
yeah, super gendered, like
Yeah.
super gendered, more so than division of labor because division of labor has become a little more equal. Men are
Mm.
doing more. I mean, talking about in heterosexual couples. Um,
Mm.
Men are stepping up. They're doing a lot more of the direct care, but women are still keeping a lot of it in their head. And they're also keeping the emotional like load in their head, the kind of sometimes I think there's like just enough worry. There's like I don't know if this is really true, but there's like so much worry you can have in the family. So if like one
Yeah.
person does all the worrying, then the other one doesn't really have to worry.
Yeah.
And that's like the emotional labor is just like feeling responsible for the well-being of the family. And
Mm.
that's like super gendered. So my colleague and I, Erin Palmwood, who's another clinical psychologist, we developed a scale. There's like been a few scales measuring mental load, and we kind of did a new spin on it. But we
Mhm.
gave it to over 500 cohabitating couples who didn't. We delinked it from childcare, but parents
Yeah.
have more mental load. But it's not. You don't
Yeah.
have to. You can still have mental load about just regular stuff that are not
Yeah.
child related. And then we looked at how it relates to anxiety, depression, marital satisfaction, and
Mm.
marital satisfaction and sexual satisfaction.
Yeah.
And the data, and then we did all these analyses, and basically we found, and then we statistically took out the relationship of actually doing chores. So this is
Mm.
like our data was like above and beyond, like statistically remove the variance of like doing the chores, and we only looked at the mental load and like thinking about it. So like delegating,
Wow.
and we basically found all these like first of all, super gendered, women are doing it way more than men. But the
Yeah.
interesting part is that it affects women and men differently. So, for
Mm.
example, delegating responsibility,
Yeah.
which is totally fine when men do it. Like, it does not
Mhm.
interfere with their well-being, and it doesn't interfere with their marital satisfaction. In fact, it may actually, like, slightly improve their like, if their marital satisfaction. Not
Yeah.
statistically, but just, like, the trend line goes up. But when women do it, like, oh,
Mm.
they hate bossing their husbands around.
Yeah.
When women do, like, the worrying, the emotional labor, total straight line between that and anxiety and depression. But for
Mm.
men, they can do the emotional labor, but it doesn't affect them at all. It's, like, flat.
Mm. Wow.
It's, like, it's really cool data. Like,
That's
I
actually
looked at
so fascinating.
I know, I was like, because you usually don't see like, it's a statistical interaction, and,
Yeah.
like, we looked at the lines, and we're like, "Oh my god." They're like, they're crossing over, like, they're, like,
Yeah.
completely, totally different implications for men and women, so I love this study.
So
It has not been published yet. We're still
mm.
shopping it. We're still shopping it, but we're presenting it at this conference, so
Wow.
I'm into it, so yeah. So that's
That
the one
sounds
thing I'm working
amazing.
on.
So is it like that when women have to delegate to other people, they feel bad because they're giving
Yeah.
people things to do? Yeah. No, I
Yeah,
get that.
or
Yeah.
they're getting like "Ugh, so you're bossing me around,"
Yeah, they're
right?
getting a bad reaction out
They're
of it.
getting a bad
Mm.
reaction. Whereas when men are like, "Honey," like if your husband said to you,
Yeah.
"Honey, you know, here's what needs to get done for the kids today. Do you
Mm.
mind if, picking up these prescriptions?"
Mm.
You would probably be like, "I'm so glad that you're like in charge of this. Of course
Yeah.
I'll pick up thank you for being in charge." I
Yeah.
am like, what I mean? It does not piss women off at all. It makes them like, yeah. So,
Yeah.
or it doesn't,
That's
wait,
so
wait,
interesting.
wait, I'm sorry. Can I state that again? Because I actually got
Of
that wrong.
course. Yeah.
So,
Start from wherever you like.
okay. So I got the data wrong. Right. So when women are telling their husbands what to do, right?
Mm.
And the husbands might, they might feel bad about it, and their husbands might be negatively reacting. And
Mm.
so it decreases their marital satisfaction.
Yeah.
But when men are telling women what to do, it doesn't bother them at all. But it's probably because the women are not mad about it. They're probably happy that their husband are taking on the tasks and doing some of that mental load. So for men, when they're kind of delegating responsibilities to their wives, they feel great about it. And also it could be that the men just don't mind bossing their wives around a little bit or telling them what to do. But it also could be that they're getting positive feedback that because the women are like pleased that they're taking on that kind of responsibility.
Yeah. And I guess for the women as well, it's like, depends on what you've experienced in the past. Like before you're even asking, you're expecting a bad reaction. So it's making you feel pent up. Even before.
That could be. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, oh, it's all on me. Can you do this thing? You know?
Yeah.
And then they're like just already annoyed that they that they have to even ask. Because, you know, they say that women don't want, you know, helpers. They want true partners, right?
Sure.
People who are really, you know, not just being told what to do, but think what it is that needs to get done and like partnership.
Take initiative or something. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think a lot of people relate to this.
That's really interesting.
Most people I've talked to like relate very hard to this, you know?
Yeah. No, I definitely do. That's such a great open mic topic, by the way. I'm so glad that you're so passionate about your research, and it is really fascinating. Like I can definitely see why this is like such a fascinating field for so many people who are studying psychology at the moment. That's really cool. So we're coming to the conclusion of our interview now, which I'm quite sad about because I've learned so much today. Can you tell us where to go to find out more about you and your work if our audience want to find out more?
Great question. I'm actually like not super active on social media, and I don't really have a ton of websites. I do have a website for my textbook, though. It's called psychologyofwomenandgender.com.
Okay.
And it has some blogs, some teaching resources. I don't, you know, other than that, you can look up my articles on Google Scholar, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't keep a social media presence. I don't find it super healthy for me. I have like a very, very, very light Facebook presence to like keep the family informed of what my kids are doing, but I'm not super, I don't have like anything else. I don't promote, I'm not super into self-promotion. I don't have any of the rest of it.
That's okay. Well, anything that you think our audience would find interesting, we can put as a link in our show notes. So that's completely fine. And we'll put that website in that you mentioned as well. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We've learned so much from you, and we're really grateful to have had you here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun. I appreciate it.
All good. And to our audience, I hope you have enjoyed and learned a lot, and we will see you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pp.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.